Hi, I'm Elena, and for 20 years I watched my mother slowly poison my father with arsenic hidden in his morning coffee. Imagine discovering that the woman who taught you to say grace before dinner, who kissed your scraped knees, who baked birthday cakes with extra frosting, was methodically murdering the man sleeping next to her every single night. But here's the twist: someone had been documenting every dose, every symptom, every lie she told the doctors, and when I finally exposed her, her confession revealed something so unthinkable that it shattered everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the lengths a mother will go to protect what she believes is hers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The thing about poison is that it's patient. It doesn't announce itself with screams or violence. It whispers. It suggests. It makes you doubt your own eyes when the person you love starts fading away so slowly that each day looks almost exactly like the one before, except for the barely perceptible dimming of their light. That's how my mother, Victoria Ashworth, nearly got away with murdering my father, Thomas, in our small mountain town of Millbrook, Colorado, one microscopic dose at a time. I should have known something was wrong when Dad started forgetting things that had been second nature to him. For 40 years. Thomas Ashworth was a man who could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded and remember every birthday, anniversary, and dentist appointment without writing anything down. He was the kind of father who never missed a school play, who taught me to change attire when I was 12, and who still brought my mother wildflowers from the meadow behind our house every Friday, even after 23 years of marriage. But by the spring of 2019, this man who could recite baseball statistics from 1987 couldn't remember where he'd put his reading glasses 5 minutes after setting them down. Mom would find them for him, of course. She always found everything. "Don't worry, honey," she'd coo, pressing the glasses into his trembling hands. "You're just stressed from work. Dr. Henley says it's completely normal for men your age." Dr. Marcus Henley had been our family physician since I was 7 years old. He delivered half the babies in Millbrook and had never misdiagnosed anything more serious than strep throat in 30 years of practice. When Dad started having what Mom called episodes, moments where he'd stare blankly at the wall or forget mid-sentence what he was saying, Dr. Henley ran every test he could think of. Blood work, MRIs, cognitive assessments. Everything came back normal, which only made Dad feel worse about what he was convinced was early-onset dementia. "Maybe it runs in families," Mom would say gently, rubbing Dad's shoulders as he sat hunched over the kitchen table, frustrated by another day of mental fog. "Your grandfather did get a bit forgetful toward the end." This was a lie. Dad's grandfather, Augustus Ashworth, had been sharp as a tack until the day he died at 91, but Dad was too confused to remember that clearly anymore. I was 24. And living in Denver, working as a forensic accountant for a firm that specialized in financial fraud cases. I'd come home every other weekend to visit, and each time I saw Dad, the changes were subtle but undeniable. His handwriting had developed a slight tremor. He'd lost maybe 15 pounds, though Mom insisted he was just being more active in his woodworking shop. His color was off, not sickly, exactly, but like someone had turned down the saturation on a photograph. "He's probably just depressed," my best friend Caitlin would say when I called her, worried. "Middle-aged men go through things, you know? Maybe he needs therapy, not more medical tests." But I knew my father. Thomas Ashworth had weathered job losses, deaths of both his parents, and the stress of raising a teenager without losing his essential Thomasness. This wasn't depression. This was something else entirely, something that made his hands shake when he tried to thread fishing line and caused him to forget the punchlines to jokes he'd been telling for decades. The first time I noticed Mom's behavior was strange was during Sunday dinner in October 2019. Dad had been having a particularly bad week. He'd gotten lost driving to the hardware store in town, a route he'd taken thousands of times. As we sat around the table, I watched Mom prepare Dad's coffee with unusual precision. She measured out exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar, added cream until the color was just right, and stirred it exactly 15 times clockwise. When I mentioned that she seemed very particular about Dad's coffee, she laughed it off. "You know your father, he's particular about everything. Has to be just right or he won't drink it." She handed him the mug with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Dad nodded, but I caught something in his expression, a flicker of confusion, like he wasn't sure that was right but couldn't remember clearly enough to disagree. He drank the coffee in small, careful sips, and within 20 minutes, the tremor in his hands had gotten noticeably worse. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the glow-in-the-dark stars I'd stuck to the ceiling when I was 10 and tried to shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong in our house. The woman downstairs humming softly as she did the dishes was the same woman who had sung me lullabies and helped me with algebra homework and cried harder than I did when our dog Buster died. But mothers don't poison their husbands. That's something. That happens in true crime podcasts and Lifetime movies, not in houses where family photos cover every surface and the refrigerator is held together with 20 years' worth of magnetic memories, except sometimes they do. And sometimes the person best positioned to see the truth is the one person who loves both the victim and the perpetrator too much to believe what's happening right in front of their eyes. What I didn't know then was that someone else had been watching too. Someone with a camera, a notebook, and 20 years' worth of evidence that would soon turn our quiet mountain town upside down and force me to confront the possibility that everything I thought I knew about my family was built on a foundation of carefully measured lies. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Ashworth house on Maple Ridge Road had always been the kind of place where neighbors felt welcome to knock on the door without calling first. Built in 1962 with honey-colored wood siding and a wraparound porch that caught the morning sun, it sat on 3 acres of pine trees and wildflower meadows that Dad had spent 2 decades carefully maintaining. Wind chimes made from old copper pipes hung from the porch eaves, creating a gentle symphony whenever the mountain breeze picked up. Inside, the walls were covered with family photos spanning 25 years, my high school graduation, their anniversary trips to Yellowstone, Dad's retirement party from the county road department. It was the kind of home that real estate agents would describe as charming and full of character, but what struck me most during those weekend visits was how the atmosphere had shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. The house still smelled like Mom's lavender soap and Dad's woodworking shop, still had the same creaky third step on the staircase and the loose doorknob on the guest bathroom that Dad kept meaning to fix. But there was something underneath the familiar comfort now, something that made me feel like I was holding my breath even when I didn't realize I was doing it. Mom moved through the house with a kind of precise efficiency that I'd never noticed before. Every morning at exactly 6:15, she would start the coffee maker, a ritual that had remained unchanged for as long as I could remember. But now I found myself watching her with forensic attention, noting how she measured Dad's instant oatmeal down to the exact serving size, how she arranged his morning medications in a small glass dish with military precision. She'd always been organized, but this felt different. Deliberate. Like someone following a very specific recipe where deviation could be dangerous. Dad, meanwhile, seemed to be shrinking into himself in increments so small that you had to know him intimately to notice. The man who used to whistle while he worked in his shop now sat quietly at his workbench, staring at half-finished birdhouses as if he couldn't remember what they were supposed to become. His laugh, which had always been quick and booming, now came delayed and uncertain, like he wasn't sure if something was actually funny or if he was just supposed to think it was. "He's just getting older," Mom would say whenever I mentioned my concerns, her voice carrying that particular tone of patient exasperation that suggested I was being overly dramatic. "Men his age slow down, Elena. It's perfectly normal." But Thomas Ashworth at 58 should have been entering his prime. He'd always been the kind of man who attacked life with enthusiasm, planning camping trips, building elaborate Christmas decorations, teaching neighborhood kids how to fish in Clearwater Creek. The fact that he now struggled to follow the plot of television shows he'd watched for years wasn't normal aging. It was something else entirely. The kitchen had become the epicenter of this strange new dynamic. Mom presided over it like a benevolent dictator, controlling every aspect of Dad's nutrition with what she called loving attention to his health. She'd replaced his regular coffee with a special blend that she ordered online, claiming it was better for his blood pressure. She monitored his salt intake, prepared separate meals when she decided restaurant food was too processed, and had started giving him supplements that she said Dr. Henley had recommended, though I'd never seen any written prescriptions. "Your father needs structure now," she explained one Saturday morning as she precisely measured vitamins into a weekly pill organizer. "Dr. Henley says routine is crucial for people with cognitive issues. I'm just trying to make things easier for him." The way she said cognitive issues made my stomach tighten. Dad had never been formally diagnosed with anything beyond what Dr. Henley diplomatically called age-related changes, but Mom had begun speaking about his condition as if it were an established fact rather than a concerning possibility. What disturbed me most was how Dad had begun to defer to her in ways that seemed fundamentally at odds with their relationship dynamic. For 23 years of marriage, they'd been partners in the truest sense, making decisions together, playfully disagreeing about everything from politics to what movie to watch on Friday nights. Dad had always been the one who handled the finances, planned their annual vacation to the Colorado Springs, and made the final call on major household purchases. Now he looked to Mom before answering even simple questions, as if he didn't trust his own judgment anymore. When I asked him about his woodworking projects, he'd glance at her first, waiting for some subtle signal before responding. When the phone rang, he'd let it go to the answering machine even if he was sitting right next to it, claiming he didn't want to bother with telemarketers, though he'd never been bothered by them before. The strangest part was how Mom had started speaking for him in social situations. At church, when longtime friends asked how Dad was feeling, she'd answer before he could open his mouth. "He's doing well, just taking things slower these days," she'd say with a practiced smile, her hand resting protectively on his arm. "The doctor says rest is the best medicine." Dad would nod along, but I caught him sometimes looking confused. As if he wasn't entirely sure he agreed with her assessment but couldn't quite formulate an alternative response. His verbal hesitation had become more pronounced, not exactly stuttering, but a kind of groping for words that used to come naturally to him. Friends and neighbors had begun to notice. Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned to me that Dad had seemed a bit off when she'd asked him about winterizing his garden. "He just stared at me for the longest time," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Like he didn't understand what I was asking." Victoria had to answer for him. Even Pastor Williams at First Methodist had pulled me aside after Sunday service to ask if everything was all right at home. "Your father seemed confused during the responsive reading," he said gently. "He kept looking around like he didn't know where he was. I just wanted to make sure he's getting the help he needs." But every time I tried to talk to Mom about getting a second medical opinion or maybe seeing a specialist in Denver, she'd bristle with defensive irritation. "Elena, honey, I know you mean well, but I'm with your father every day. I see what helps him and what doesn't. Dr. Henley has been treating this family for years, he knows what he's doing." The conversations always ended the same way, with me feeling like I was being unreasonable for wanting answers to questions that seemed increasingly urgent. Mom had a way of making my concerns sound like the anxious overreactions of a daughter who didn't understand the realities of aging, who lived too far away to see the full picture, who was perhaps projecting her own fears onto a situation that was sad but ultimately natural, except nothing about Dad's decline felt natural. It felt orchestrated, managed, carefully controlled in ways that made the hair on my arms stand up even when I couldn't articulate why. And in the quiet moments between conversations, when I thought no one was looking, I sometimes caught Mom watching Dad with an expression I'd never seen before, clinical, measuring, like a scientist observing the progress of a long-term experiment. Christmas morning 2019 was supposed to be perfect. Mom had spent weeks preparing, decorating the house with her usual meticulous attention to detail, fresh garland draped along the banister, white lights twinkling from every window, and the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the oven since dawn. Dad's handmade ornaments from years past hung carefully on the 12-foot Douglas fir he'd cut from our back property, each one positioned exactly where it had been the previous year because Mom believed in maintaining family traditions. I'd driven up from Denver on Christmas Eve, my car loaded with presents and a growing sense of dread I couldn't shake. The 3-hour drive through the mountains had given me too much time to think about the phone call I'd received from Dad the week before, the one where he'd called me Sarah 3 times before catching himself, Sarah being the name of his sister who died in 1987. When I gently corrected him, he'd gone quiet for a long moment before saying, "Of course, Elena. I don't know why I said that. Must be tired." But Dad had never been the type to confuse names, even when exhausted. Thomas Ashworth had a memory like a steel trap for personal details, especially when it came to family. The fact that he'd mixed up his daughter with his deceased sister wasn't just concerning, it was impossible. The morning started normally enough. Mom bustled around the kitchen preparing what she called Dad's special Christmas breakfast, scrambled eggs with herbs from her garden, turkey bacon because it was healthier for his heart, and fresh orange juice squeezed from fruit she'd ordered specially from a grove in California. She'd always gone overboard for holidays, but this year felt different. Every gesture seemed calculated, performed for an invisible audience. Dad sat at the kitchen table in his favorite flannel robe, the one I'd given him for Father's Day 5 years earlier. He looked smaller somehow, as if the robe had grown around him while he'd diminished inside it. His hair, which had always been thick and silver, seemed thinner, and there were dark circles under his eyes that makeup couldn't have hidden. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," he said when he saw me, and for a moment his smile was pure Dad, warm, genuine, completely present. "I was just telling your mother how excited I was to see you." But when I hugged him, I could feel how much weight he'd lost. His shoulders, which used to be broad enough for me to hide behind as a child, felt fragile under my hands. And there was a smell about him that I couldn't identify, not unpleasant, exactly, but medicinal, like he'd been taking vitamins that hadn't quite been processed by his system. Mom served breakfast with her usual efficiency, placing Dad's plate in front of him with a kiss on the top of his head. "Eat up, honey," she said. You need your strength for opening presents. That's when it happened. Dad picked up his orange juice, the special juice Mom had made just for him, and took a long drink. Within seconds, his face went pale. Not the gradual pallor of someone feeling sick, but the immediate, startling whiteness of someone whose blood pressure had suddenly plummeted. The glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the hardwood floor and shattering into pieces that scattered under the breakfast nook. Thomas! Mom cried, rushing to his side, but there was something in her voice, not surprise, exactly, but something that sounded almost like resignation. Like she'd been expecting this. Dad tried to stand up, his hands gripping the edge of the table, but his legs wouldn't support him. He looked around the room with the confused, desperate expression of someone who couldn't understand what was happening to their own body. I feel. He started, then stopped, his face contorting with effort. I can't, the room is. He collapsed back into his chair, his head lolling to one side. For a terrifying moment, I thought he was having a stroke. Call 911, I shouted, already reaching for my phone, but Mom's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. No, she said firmly. It's just another episode. Dr. Henley said this might happen. The stress of the holidays can trigger symptoms. Symptoms? Of what? I demanded, trying to pull my phone free. Mom, look at him. This isn't normal. Dad's breathing had become shallow and rapid. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, and there was a grayish tinge to his lips that made my heart race with panic. But Mom seemed weirdly calm, like she was following a script she'd rehearsed. Elena, honey, I know this is scary, but panicking won't help your father. I've seen this before. He just needs to rest, and he'll be fine in a few hours. You've seen this before? The words came out sharper than I'd intended. When? How many times? Mom's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A few times recently. Dr. Henley thinks it's related to his cognitive decline. Sometimes the brain sends mixed signals to the body. That's when Dad made a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life, a low, keening moan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. It was the sound of someone in serious distress, someone whose body was failing them in ways they couldn't understand or control. I'm calling an ambulance, I said, yanking my hand free from Mom's grip and dialing 911 before she could stop me. 911, what's your emergency? My father has collapsed. He's conscious but barely responsive, his breathing is shallow, and his lips are turning gray. We need an ambulance at 247 Maple Ridge Road in Millbrook. Mom stood frozen beside Dad's chair. And for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her face, anger, I thought, though that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Why would she be angry that I was getting help for Dad? The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, though it felt like hours. By the time they got there, Dad had stabilized somewhat, his color had improved and his breathing had returned to normal, though he still seemed disoriented and weak. The lead paramedic, a woman named Janet who looked like she'd seen everything, checked his vital signs and asked a series of questions that Mom answered with practiced efficiency. Has he been experiencing any other symptoms lately? Changes in appetite, sleep patterns, cognitive function? Yes, Mom said, her voice taking on the weary tone of a long-suffering caregiver. He's been having some issues with memory and confusion. His doctor thinks it might be early-stage dementia. Any new medications? Changes in diet? Nothing significant. I've been very careful about his nutrition since he started having problems. Janet looked at Dad, who was staring at his hands like he'd never seen them before. Sir, can you tell me your name and the date? Thomas, he said slowly. Thomas Ashworth. He paused, struggling. It's Christmas? But I don't know what year. The paramedics exchanged a look. Janet recommended taking him to Millbrook General for observation, but Mom intervened again. I really think he'll be more comfortable at home, she said. These episodes always pass, and the hospital just stresses him out. Dr. Henley said that unless it's a true emergency, home care is preferable. I wanted to argue, but Dad himself seemed to rally at the mention of staying home. I'm okay, he said, though his voice was still shaky. Just got dizzy for a minute. I want to stay here for Christmas. The paramedics left after making sure Dad's vitals were stable, but not before giving me a card with instructions about when to call back. As soon as they were gone, Mom went into overdrive cleaning mode, sweeping up the broken glass with sharp, efficient movements. Well, that was quite a scare, she said, as if Dad had simply tripped over the coffee table instead of having what looked like a serious medical episode. But he's fine now. These things happen when you get older. But Dad wasn't fine. For the rest of Christmas Day, he moved through the house like a ghost of himself, opening presents with mechanical politeness but no real joy. When I asked him if he remembered making the wooden jewelry box he'd given me 3 years earlier, he stared at it for a long moment before shaking his head. I'm sorry, honey. I know I should remember, but I don't. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about the timing of Dad's collapse. He'd been fine until he drank the orange juice, the special juice that Mom had made specifically for him. And her reaction when I tried to call 911 hadn't been the response of a terrified wife. It had been the reaction of someone who was annoyed by an unexpected complication. I thought about all the small things I'd noticed over the past few months: Mom's obsessive control over Dad's food and medication, her defensive responses to my suggestions about seeking additional medical care, the way she spoke about his condition as if it were a foregone conclusion rather than something to be fought. And I thought about something else: the look on her face in that split second before the paramedics arrived. It wasn't grief or fear, or even confusion. It was guilt. The drive back to Denver the day after Christmas was the longest 3 hours of my life. Every mile I put between myself and Millbrook felt like abandonment, but I couldn't shake the certainty that staying would have meant watching Mom more carefully, and I wasn't ready for what I might discover. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I had to pull over twice because my vision kept blurring with tears I couldn't explain. Dad's face haunted me, the confusion in his eyes when he'd looked at the jewelry box he'd crafted with his own hands, the way he'd seemed to shrink into himself after the paramedics left. But more than that, I couldn't stop thinking about Mom's reaction to his collapse. The more I replayed those crucial moments, the more wrong they felt. She'd moved to help him, yes, but there had been no shock in her movements, no genuine panic. It was like watching someone perform emergency response rather than live it. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex in Denver. Mom's name flashed on the screen. "Elena, honey, I just wanted to check that you got home safely." Her voice carried that familiar note of maternal concern that would have been comforting under normal circumstances. Now it made my stomach clench. "I'm fine, Mom. How's Dad?" "Oh, he's much better today. Back to his normal self. I told you those episodes just pass with rest." There was something too bright in her tone, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "He's out in his workshop right now, puttering around with some project." This surprised me. Dad hadn't spent meaningful time in his workshop in months, claiming he couldn't concentrate well enough to work with power tools safely. "Really? What's he working on?" A pause. Just a beat too long. "Oh, you know your father. Always has some little project going. I think he's organizing his tools or something." After we hung up, I sat in my car in the parking garage, engine ticking. As it cooled, and made a decision that would change everything. I called Millbrook General and asked to speak with someone about the previous day's emergency call to Maple Ridge Road. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't discuss patient information over the phone," the nurse explained patiently. "I'm not asking for medical details. I just want to know if there's been a pattern of similar calls to that address." Another pause. "Are you family?" "I'm his daughter." "Hold on, let me check with our dispatch records." The hold music played for what felt like an eternity. When she came back, her voice had changed, more cautious, more professional. "Ma'am, I'm showing 3 emergency calls to that address in the past 6 months. All involving the same patient, all with similar presenting symptoms." 3 calls. 3 episodes that Mom had never mentioned, that she'd somehow managed to handle without involving me despite the fact that I'd specifically asked her to keep me informed about Dad's health. "Can you tell me what those symptoms were?" "I really can't go into specifics, but I can tell you that our paramedics filed a notation suggesting the patient might benefit from a comprehensive medical evaluation at a larger facility." "What kind of notation?" "The type we file when we see patterns that concern us." I thanked her and hung up, my heart pounding. Patterns that concerned the paramedics. 3 previous episodes that Mom had hidden from me. A daughter who worked in forensic accounting, trained to spot inconsistencies and follow paper trails, and I'd been missing something huge happening right under my nose. That night, I called Dad directly on his cell phone, something I rarely did because Mom usually answered the house phone and handled their social calendar. When he picked up, he sounded tired but more like himself than he had in months. "Elena. What a nice surprise. Your mother's at her book club, so I have the house to myself." "Dad, I wanted to ask you about yesterday. Do you remember what happened before you felt sick?" "Yesterday?" He was quiet for a moment, and I could practically hear him sorting through memories that didn't quite connect. "We had Christmas breakfast, didn't we? You were there. But after that?" His voice trailed off. "I remember feeling strange, like the room was spinning." "Did I fall?" "You collapsed after drinking orange juice." "Do you remember the orange juice?" "Orange juice?" Another long pause. "Your mother makes me drink a lot of different things. Says they're good for my health. Sometimes I can't keep track of what's what." Something in his tone made me lean forward, even though we were talking on the phone. Dad, what kind of things does she give you? Oh, vitamins, supplements, special drinks. She orders them online, says Dr. Henley recommended them. But Elena. His voice dropped to a whisper, and I realized he was checking to make sure Mom wasn't home. Sometimes I don't feel right after I take them. But when I mention it to your mother, she says it's just my imagination, that I'm getting confused because of my memory problems. What kind of not feeling right? Dizzy. Nauseous. Sometimes my hands shake so badly I can't hold my coffee cup steady. But it always passes, so I figure she must know what she's talking about. She takes such good care of me. After we hung up, I sat on my couch staring at my laptop screen, cursor blinking in the search bar. I started with supplements that cause dizziness and fell down a rabbit hole that kept me awake until 4 in the morning. Arsenic poisoning. Heavy metal toxicity. Drug interactions. Symptoms that perfectly matched what Dad had been experiencing: confusion, memory loss, tremors, gastrointestinal distress, weight loss. But researching potential causes was one thing. Proving that my mother was systematically poisoning my father was another thing entirely, and the magnitude of what I was considering made me feel like I was losing my mind. This was Victoria Ashworth, the woman who had organized bake sales for my school fundraisers and never missed sending birthday cards to distant relatives. The woman who still cried during sentimental commercials and kept a photo of her and Dad's wedding day on her nightstand after 23 years, except when I really thought about it. When had I last seen Mom cry about anything other than television? When had I last seen her show genuine emotion about Dad's condition beyond frustration at his limitations? She spoke about his decline with the detached concern of a healthcare professional discussing a patient, not a wife watching her husband disappear. I made a list of things I needed to find out. What specific supplements was Mom giving Dad? Where was she ordering them from? Were they actually prescribed by Dr. Henley, or was that another lie? How long had the symptoms really been going on? And most importantly, was there any way to test Dad's blood or urine without alerting Mom to what I was investigating? By Tuesday, I'd developed a plan. I called in sick to work and drove back to Millbrook, telling Mom I'd forgotten some Christmas presents and needed to pick them up. When I arrived at the house, Dad was napping in his recliner, something that had become a daily occurrence, Mom explained, because he tires so easily now. While Mom went to the grocery store, I conducted what felt like a forensic audit of my childhood home. In the kitchen, I found a cabinet I'd never paid attention to before, filled with bottles and containers that looked more like a pharmacy than a vitamin collection. Chelation therapy supplements. Heavy-duty probiotics. Something called detox support formula that promised to eliminate harmful toxins from the body. But it was what I found in Mom's bedroom that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the back of her lingerie drawer, underneath satin nightgowns that still had tags on them, was a notebook. Not a journal or diary, but something that looked more like a medical chart. Pages of careful handwriting documenting Dad's symptoms, his daily routine, his reactions to different treatments. Dates, times, dosages of various supplements. And at the bottom of several pages, notes like increased confusion, reduce morning dose, and tremors more pronounced, switch to evening administration. It read like a clinical trial. Like someone was systematically testing the effects of various substances on a human subject and carefully documenting the results. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands shaking so badly I had to retake several shots. By the time I heard Mom's car in the driveway, I discovered something else, a separate section in the notebook titled Emergency Protocols. Instructions for what to do if Dad's symptoms became too pronounced. How to talk to paramedics. What to tell doctors. How to present his condition as a natural progression of age-related cognitive decline rather than something being artificially induced. The woman I'd called Mom for 24 years had turned my father into a human laboratory experiment, and she'd been documenting it with the methodical precision of a research scientist. When Mom came back from the store, chattering about the post-Christmas sales and how crowded the grocery store had been, I sat at the kitchen table and smiled and nodded and helped her put away groceries. But inside, I was calculating how long it would take to drive back to Denver, how quickly I could get the photos to someone who would know what to do with them, and how I was going to save my father's life without destroying what was left of our family, because one thing was clear from reading that notebook: if I didn't act soon, Dad's next episode might be his last. I drove back to Denver that evening with Mom's notebook photos burning like acid in my phone, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them again. Every time I thought about those clinical notes documenting Dad's suffering, my hands started shaking so badly I had to pull over. By the time I reached my apartment, I was operating on pure adrenaline and the terrifying certainty that I was in way over my head. Who do you call when you discover your mother is poisoning your father? The police seemed like the obvious answer. But what if they didn't believe me? What if Mom had covered her tracks so well that my accusations just made me look like a paranoid daughter? What if confronting her directly just made her more careful, more dangerous? I was sitting on my kitchen floor at midnight, laptop open, trying to research Colorado's laws about elder abuse, when my doorbell rang. At first I ignored it. It was probably just a neighbor or someone with the wrong apartment. But the ringing persisted, followed by urgent knocking. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't recognize. Middle-aged, wearing scrubs under a heavy winter coat, with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked exhausted and nervous, glancing over her shoulder like she was afraid of being followed. "Elena Ashworth," she called through the door. "I'm Janet Morrison. I was one of the paramedics who responded to your father's call on Christmas Day. I need to talk to you about Thomas." My heart nearly stopped. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers suddenly clumsy with panic and hope in equal measure. "How did you find me?" I asked as I opened the door. "Your address was on the emergency contact form. Look, I probably shouldn't be here, but I can't stop thinking about your father's case." She looked around my hallway nervously. "Can I come in? This isn't something I want to discuss in a public corridor." I led her to my living room, clearing law textbooks and printouts about arsenic poisoning off the couch. Janet sat down heavily, like someone who'd been carrying a burden for too long. "I've been a paramedic for 15 years, she began without preamble. "I've seen everything you can imagine, and some things you probably can't. But your father's case has been keeping me awake at night." "What do you mean?" Janet pulled out a small notebook from her coat pocket, much smaller and more worn than the one I'd found in Mom's bedroom. "I started keeping my own records after the second call to your house. Something didn't add up." She flipped through pages covered in neat handwriting. "First call was August 15th. Your father presented with severe gastric distress, dehydration, and confusion. Blood pressure dangerously low. Your mother said he'd been having stomach problems for a few days, blamed it on something he ate." I felt my chest tighten. Mom never told me about that call. Second call was October 3rd, similar symptoms, but also tremors and what looked like mild seizure activity. Your mother again attributed it to his condition, said his doctor was managing it with dietary changes. "And the third call? Christmas Day. You were there for that one." Janet looked up from her notebook, her eyes serious. "Elena, in 15 years of emergency medicine, I've never seen anyone have 3 separate medical episodes with those specific symptoms unless they were either severely ill with a diagnosed condition, or what?" She hesitated. "Or they were being systematically poisoned." The words hung in the air between us like a confession. Hearing someone else say it, someone with medical training, someone who'd seen Dad's symptoms firsthand, made it real in a way that all my internet research couldn't. "You think my mother is poisoning him," I said quietly. "I think your father is being poisoned by someone with access to his food and medications, someone who knows enough about the substances they're using to control the dosing, and someone who has a prepared explanation for each emergency." Janet closed her notebook carefully. "The question is whether you've noticed the same patterns I have." I showed her the photos on my phone. Janet's face went white as she scrolled through the images of Mom's clinical notes. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. This is a medical log. She's been documenting her experiments on him. I found it hidden in her bedroom." "Janet, I don't know what to do. If I go to the police, what if they can't prove anything? What if she just gets more careful and kills him slowly?" Janet was quiet for a long moment, studying the photos. When she looked up, her expression had changed from concern to something harder, more determined. "Elena, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that might help." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like a video file. "I started recording our interactions with your mother after the second call. Partially for my own protection, if we were dealing with a potential abuse situation. I wanted documentation. But also because something about her responses felt rehearsed." She turned the phone toward me. The video showed Mom standing in our kitchen on Christmas morning, talking to the paramedics with that same practiced calm I'd noticed. But Janet had been recording from an angle where you could see more than just Mom's face, you could see her hands. "Watch her left hand," Janet said, pointing to the screen. In the video, Mom was explaining Dad's condition to the paramedics, her voice steady and concerned. But her left hand, partially hidden behind her back, was clenched into a fist so tight that her knuckles were white. And every few seconds, when she thought no one was looking, she would tap her fingers against her leg in a rapid, nervous pattern. "That's not the behavior of someone who's genuinely worried about their spouse," Janet explained. "That's the behavior of someone who's trying very hard to control a situation they've orchestrated." She had more videos from the previous calls, all showing similar patterns. Mom's verbal responses were always appropriate, always helpful, always designed to direct attention away from the possibility of poisoning. But her body language told a different story, the story of someone under enormous stress, someone maintaining a performance that was becoming harder to sustain. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "Why are you helping me?" Janet's expression softened. "Because I have a father too. And because sometimes in this job, you see things that you can't unsee, things that follow you home. Your father is being murdered slowly, deliberately, by someone who should be protecting him. I took an oath to help people, and that doesn't end when my shift is over." She handed me a business card with her personal cell phone number written on the back. "I've already spoken with Detective Sarah Chen at Millbrook PD. She specializes in domestic abuse cases, and she's agreed to look at the evidence if you're ready to file a report." "What kind of evidence would they need?" "Ideally, blood or urine samples showing elevated levels of whatever she's been giving him. The medical records from his doctor showing the timeline of his decline. And this notebook, if we can prove it's in your mother's handwriting, it's essentially a confession." For the first time since Christmas morning, I felt like I could breathe properly. Someone else knew. Someone else had been watching, documenting, building a case. I wasn't alone in this nightmare. "There's one more thing," Janet said as she stood to leave. "I did some research on the supplements your mother mentioned to us during the Christmas call. The specific brands she named? 2 of them have been recalled by the FDA for containing undisclosed heavy metals. The third one isn't actually a supplement at all, it's a chelation therapy drug that's only supposed to be administered under medical supervision." "What does that mean?" "It means she's not just giving him random vitamins. She knows exactly what she's doing, and she's using substances that are specifically designed to cause the symptoms your father has been experiencing." Janet paused at my front door. "Elena, your mother isn't experimenting on your father. She's perfecting a method." After she left, I sat in my darkened living room and finally understood why Mom had been so defensive about getting second medical opinions. Why she'd been so controlling about Dad's care, why she'd hidden the previous emergency calls from me. This wasn't a sudden mental break or a crime of passion. This was a long-term plan being executed with scientific precision, but Janet's visit had given me something I hadn't had before: hope and evidence. And most importantly, an ally who understood the medical aspects of what Mom was doing well enough to help me stop her. The question now wasn't whether I should report this. The question was whether I could gather enough proof to save Dad's life before Mom's next adjustment to his treatment killed him. Armed with Janet's evidence and the business card for Detective Chen, I should have felt ready to move forward. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by a question that had been gnawing at me since discovering Mom's notebook: how long had this really been going on? And more importantly, who else knew? The next morning, I called in sick to work again and drove to Millbrook General Hospital. If Dad had been having symptoms for longer than the 6 months Janet's records covered, there would be medical documentation. As his daughter, I had a right to request his medical history, but I needed to be careful not to alert Mom to what I was investigating. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the hospital's chief of internal medicine, agreed to meet with me after I explained that I was concerned about my father's declining health and wanted to understand his treatment history. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your father's case has been puzzling for our entire staff," she said, pulling up his file on her computer. "He's been seen here 17 times in the past 18 months. 17 times. Janet's records only went back 6 months, which meant there had been 11 additional incidents that even the paramedics didn't know about." "What kind of visits?" I asked, though I was already dreading the answer. "Emergency department visits. Mostly. Severe dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, gastric distress, neurological symptoms." Dr. Martinez scrolled through the records, her frown deepening. "We've run every test imaginable: CT scans, MRIs, comprehensive blood panels, toxicology screens. Everything comes back normal, or close enough to normal that we can't pinpoint a cause." "Toxicology screens?" "Standard procedure when someone presents with neurological symptoms of unknown origin. But the tests we run routinely don't catch everything, especially if someone is being exposed to substances in small doses over time." She turned her monitor so I could see Dad's chart. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Emergency visits clustered around holidays, family gatherings, and times when I would have been expected to visit. Each incident followed the same trajectory: severe symptoms, rapid stabilization, discharge with recommendations for follow-up care that apparently never happened. Dr. Martinez, who usually brings my father in for these visits. "According to our records, it's always been your mother. She's been very involved in his care, very knowledgeable about his symptoms. She even brought in a detailed log of his daily routine and dietary habits to help us identify potential triggers." My blood ran cold. A log? Yes, very thorough documentation. Honestly, most family caregivers aren't nearly as organized. It's been helpful for tracking patterns, though we still haven't been able to identify the underlying cause of his episodes. Mom had been feeding the hospital false information, using her own documentation of Dad's poisoning to create a medical paper trail that supported her narrative of mysterious illness. She'd turned her crime log into evidence of her devoted caregiving. Dr. Martinez, I need to ask you something, and I need you to take it seriously. Is it possible that my father is being poisoned? Her expression shifted immediately from professional concern to sharp attention. What makes you ask that? I showed her the photos of Mom's notebook. Dr. Martinez studied them carefully, her face growing pale as she read through Mom's clinical observations and dosage adjustments. This is a systematic poisoning protocol, she said finally. Whoever wrote this has medical knowledge. They understand drug interactions, absorption rates, symptom management. She looked up at me with horror in her eyes. Elena, this person has been using your father as a test subject for different poisoning methods. My mother wrote this. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. We need to get your father in here immediately for comprehensive testing. If he's been exposed to these substances for 18 months, there could be permanent organ damage. What if she won't bring him in? What if she suspects that I know? Then we involve Adult Protective Services and the police. Elena, your father's life is in immediate danger. According to these notes, she's been escalating the dosages. The margin between incapacitation and death is getting narrower with each experiment. After leaving the hospital, I sat in my car in the parking lot and called my Aunt Linda, Mom's younger sister who lived in Colorado Springs. Linda had always been the family gossip, the one who knew everyone's business whether they wanted her to or not. If anyone had noticed strange patterns in Mom's behavior, it would be her. Elena. What a nice surprise. How are your parents doing? Victoria mentioned that Thomas has been having some health issues. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Aunt Linda. When did Mom first mention Dad's health problems to you? Oh, let me think. It's been quite a while now. Maybe 2 years ago? She called me one evening, very upset, saying Thomas had been acting confused and forgetful. She was worried it might be Alzheimer's. 2 years. The poisoning had been going on for at least 2 years, not 18 months. Which meant Mom had been planning this, documenting it, and refining her methods for far longer than anyone realized. Did she ask you for any advice? Any recommendations for doctors or treatments? Well, that's the strange thing. She seemed to already have it all figured out. She'd researched specialists, found these online support groups for caregivers, even started giving him special supplements she'd ordered from some company in California. I remember thinking how quickly she'd adapted to the situation. What kind of supplements? Oh, I don't remember the names. But she was very excited about them, said they were supposed to help with cognitive function and detoxification. She even offered to send me some for my arthritis, but they were quite expensive. Expensive supplements. From California. The same supplements that had been recalled for heavy metal contamination. Mom hadn't stumbled into poisoning Dad, she'd researched it, sourced the materials, and marketed it to the family as devoted caregiving. Aunt Linda, has Mom ever talked to you about Dad's will or their finances? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Why would you ask that? I'm just trying to understand the whole situation. Well, she did mention that they'd updated their estate planning recently. Something about making sure Thomas's affairs were in order in case his condition got worse. But Elena, that's just responsible planning when someone is facing cognitive decline. After we hung up, I sat staring at my phone, pieces of a horrifying puzzle clicking into place. Mom hadn't just been poisoning Dad for the sadistic pleasure of watching him suffer. She'd been creating a medical record, a family narrative, and a legal framework that would protect her when he finally died. The frequent hospital visits established a pattern of mysterious illness. The detailed logs she'd shared with doctors created evidence of her devoted caregiving. The updated estate planning ensured she'd inherit everything. And the gradual escalation of dosages meant Dad's death would look like the natural progression of a degenerative disease that had baffled medical professionals. This wasn't just poisoning. It was the perfect murder, planned and executed over years with meticulous attention to detail. Mom had been building an airtight alibi while slowly killing her husband, and she'd almost succeeded, but there was one thing she hadn't counted on: Janet Morrison's suspicious nature and Elena Ashworth's forensic training. Between the two of us, we'd uncovered enough evidence to expose the entire conspiracy. I called Detective Chen and scheduled a meeting for the next morning. Tonight, I would drive back to Millbrook one more time, but not to confront Mom or gather more evidence. Tonight, I was going to save my father's life by taking him somewhere safe while we built the case that would put his would-be murderer behind bars. The only question now was whether I could get him away from her without triggering the final phase of her plan. That evening, as I drove through the winding mountain roads toward Millbrook for what I hoped would be the last time as an unknowing accomplice to attempted murder, I found myself thinking about something that had been bothering me since my conversation with Aunt Linda. How does someone decide to murder their spouse of 23 years? When does love turn into such calculated hatred that you can document someone suffering like a science experiment? I needed to understand the why before I could face the what next, so instead of going straight to the house, I stopped at Rosie's Diner on Main Street. Rosie Kellerman had owned the place for 30 years and knew every piece of gossip in Millbrook County. If there were cracks in my parents' marriage that I'd missed, she would know about them. Elena Ashworth. Haven't seen you in months, honey. How are your folks doing? Rosie's voice carried the practiced cheerfulness of someone who spent her days managing other people's emotions along with their coffee orders. That's actually what I wanted to ask you about, Rosie. You've known my parents longer than almost anyone. Have you ever noticed anything unusual about their relationship? Rosie's expression shifted slightly, the way it does when someone realizes a casual conversation is about to become something more serious. She glanced around the nearly empty diner, then poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. What kind of unusual are we talking about? I don't know. Arguments, tension, anything that seemed off. Rosie was quiet for a moment, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. Elena, honey, I've been wondering when someone was going to ask me about this. My heart rate picked up. About what? Your parents' marriage has been complicated for a lot longer than most people realize. She leaned forward, lowering her voice even though we were practically alone. This is going to be hard to hear, but I think there are some things you should know about your family history. What Rosie told me next shattered everything I thought I understood about my parents' love story. They hadn't met at the community college dance in 1995, the way they'd always told me. They'd met 2 years earlier, when Mom was married to someone else. Someone named David Crawford who'd worked construction with Dad and who'd died in what everyone assumed was a tragic accident. David was a good man, Rosie said carefully. Quiet, hardworking, absolutely devoted to Victoria. But he had a problem with his heart, some kind of congenital condition that made him tired all the time. He was only 28 when he died. How did he die? Heart failure, supposedly. But Elena, the thing is, David had been managing his condition just fine for years. He took medication, saw his cardiologist regularly, followed all the rules. Then suddenly, in the span of about 6 months, his health just deteriorated. Fast. The parallels to Dad's situation made my stomach clench. What kind of deterioration? Confusion, memory problems, weakness. His doctor kept adjusting his medications, but nothing seemed to help. Your mother was so devoted during that time, taking care of him around the clock, managing all his pills and doctor's appointments. Rosie's expression was grim. Sound familiar? I felt like the diner was tilting around me. Are you saying you think Mom killed her first husband too? I'm saying David Crawford was perfectly healthy until he married Victoria, and 6 months after the wedding, he was dead. And within a year of his death, she was married to your father. Rosie reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Elena, I've been watching your mother take care of sick men for nearly 30 years. The pattern is always the same. Why didn't anyone ever say anything? Because what were we supposed to say? That the grieving widow might have murdered her husband? Based on what evidence? She was devastated when David died, absolutely heartbroken. She threw herself into caring for Thomas like she was trying to make up for losing David. Everyone thought it was beautiful, the way she found love again after such tragedy. But now I understood that it wasn't grief that had driven Mom to Dad. It was success. She'd gotten away with murder once, inherited David's life insurance and property, and found herself a new victim to practice on. Rosie, do you remember anything specific about David's symptoms before he died? Dizzy spells, nausea, tremors in his hands. Victoria said the doctors thought it was related to his heart condition, but she trailed off, shaking her head. Elena, I've been serving coffee to this town for 3 decades. I've seen every kind of heartbreak, every kind of family crisis. But I've never seen 2 different men develop identical mysterious symptoms while being cared for by the same woman. After leaving the diner, I sat in my car behind the Methodist church where my parents had been married, where I'd been baptized, where we'd celebrated every major holiday for 24 years. The church where Mom had also married David Crawford, I now realized. The same altar, the same pastor, the same woman promising to love and cherish until death do us part. Except for Victoria, death wasn't something that happened to marriages, it Was something she made happen. I called Detective Chen from the church parking lot. Detective, this is Elena Ashworth. I need to add something to the case we're building. My mother has done this before. What do you mean? She was married before my father. Her first husband died of heart failure in 1995, but the symptoms sound identical to what she's been doing to Dad. Confusion, weakness, tremors, managed by my mother with careful attention to his medications. Detective Chen was quiet for a moment. Elena, if what you're suggesting is true, we're not just looking at attempted murder. We're looking at a serial killer. The words hung in the winter air like a death sentence. Serial killer. Not just a woman who'd lost her mind and was hurting her husband, but someone who had developed a method, perfected it, and used it multiple times. Someone who viewed marriage as a long-term business arrangement with built-in exit strategies. Detective, there's something else. I think she's escalating with my father. The dosages in her notebook have been increasing, and according to his medical records, he's been hospitalized more frequently in recent months. I think she's moving toward the endgame. How long do you think we have? I thought about Dad's collapse on Christmas morning, about the gray tinge to his lips and the way his body had simply shut down. About Mom's clinical notes documenting his declining tolerance for her treatments. Not long. Maybe days. Elena, do not confront your mother. Do not let her know that you suspect anything. We need to move carefully here because if she realizes we're onto her, she might accelerate her timeline. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that careful wasn't an option anymore. Mom had been planning Dad's death for years, documenting every step, building the perfect cover story. She had medical professionals convinced that he was suffering from early-onset dementia. She had the family prepared for his decline. She had estate planning in place to inherit everything. The only thing standing between Victoria Ashworth and the successful completion of her second murder was her daughter's inconvenient discovery of the truth. And if she realized that her secret was out, she wouldn't hesitate to eliminate that obstacle too. I thought about all the times she'd offered me special tea when I visited. Insisted I try her homemade cookies, prepared meals, just for the family. How many times had I been a potential victim without realizing it? How many times had she tested substances on me the same way she'd been testing them on Dad, as I drove toward the house where I'd grown up, where I'd felt safe and loved for 24 years, I realized I was walking into the lair of someone who had been perfecting murder for decades. Someone who knew exactly how to kill people slowly while maintaining the perfect facade of loving caregiving, someone who wouldn't hesitate to add one more name to her list if it meant protecting her secret. When I finally pulled into the driveway of 247 Maple Ridge Road that night, every light in the house was on, which was unusual. Mom was obsessive about conserving electricity, always lecturing Dad and me about turning off lights when we left rooms. But tonight, the house blazed like a beacon against the dark mountain sky, and I could see her silhouette moving back and forth past the kitchen window with agitated, rapid movements. Something was wrong. I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, considering whether I should call Detective Chen and wait for backup. But if Dad was in immediate danger, every minute could matter. I turned off the car and walked toward the front door, noting that Mom's prized flower beds looked like they'd been recently disturbed, fresh soil scattered on the frozen ground, holes dug and hastily filled. Before I could knock, the door swung open. Mom stood there in her bathrobe and slippers, but her hair was perfect and she was wearing makeup despite the late hour. Her smile was too bright, too wide, like someone practicing for a performance. Elena. What a wonderful surprise. I was just thinking about you. She stepped aside to let me in, but I noticed she positioned herself between me and the rest of the house. What brings you back so soon? I wanted to check on Dad. How's he feeling today? Oh, much better. Much better. In fact, he's sleeping. So peacefully I decided not to wake him for dinner. Her laugh sounded forced, artificial. You know how important rest is for his condition. The house felt different from the inside. The familiar comfort I'd always associated with home was gone, replaced by something that made my skin crawl. The air smelled wrong, not just the usual lavender and wood smoke, but something chemical underneath, like cleaning supplies or medical disinfectant. Mom, what's that smell? What smell? But her eyes darted toward the kitchen, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. Bottles and containers scattered across the counter, a mortar and pestle with white residue, and what looked like a digital scale of the type used for measuring precise amounts of medication. I think I'll just peek in on Dad, if that's okay. Actually, honey, let's not disturb him. Why don't we have some tea instead? I just put the kettle on. She moved toward the kitchen with that same agitated energy I'd seen through the window, but her voice remained artificially cheerful. I have that chamomile blend you used to love as a child. Every instinct I had screamed against drinking anything. Mom prepared, but I followed her to the kitchen anyway. What I saw there confirmed my worst fears. The counter looked like a laboratory, multiple bottles of supplements, measuring spoons, notebooks open with calculations written in Mom's precise handwriting. But it was what I saw in the trash can that made my knees go weak. Empty vials. At least a dozen of them, the kind used for prescription medications, scattered among wadded paper towels stained with what looked like blood. Mom, what is all this? She followed my gaze to the counter, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes, something that had probably been there all along but hidden behind 24 years of maternal performance. Oh, just organizing Thomas's medications. Dr. Henley wants me to be more precise about dosages. She began hastily shoving bottles into a cabinet, but her movements were too quick, too panicked. You know how complicated his treatment has become. Where is Dad? I told you, he's sleeping. I want to see him. Elena. Her voice changed, dropping the artificial sweetness. Sit down. We need to talk. Instead of sitting, I moved toward the hallway that led to my parents' bedroom. Mom intercepted me, her hand gripping my wrist with surprising strength. I said sit down. That's when I heard it, a faint sound coming from somewhere in the house. Not quite a moan, not quite a word, but definitely human. And definitely in distress. Dad. I called out, trying to pull free from Mom's grip. Elena, stop this right now. You're being dramatic. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the basement. Why would Dad be in the basement? He hadn't been down there in months, claiming the stairs were too difficult for him to navigate safely. Unless he wasn't down there by choice. Let go of me. I yanked my arm free and headed for the basement door. Elena, don't. Mom's voice had gone completely flat now, all pretense abandoned. You don't want to see what's down there. But I was already opening the door, already starting down the wooden steps that creaked under my weight. The basement was dark except for a single work light hanging from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across Dad's old workshop. And there, slumped in a chair in the corner, was my father. He was barely conscious, his head lolling to one side. His breathing shallow and labored. His wrists were zip-tied to the arms of the chair, and there was dried blood on his shirt. But he was alive. Dad. I rushed toward him, but stopped short when I saw what was arranged on his workbench like some kind of twisted medical display. Syringes. For bags. Bottles of clear liquid with handwritten labels. And a video camera on a tripod, pointed directly at the chair where Dad was restrained. She'd been filming it. Whatever she was doing to him, she'd been documenting it on video. Elena. Mom's voice came from behind me on the stairs. I really wish you hadn't come down here. I turned to face her, and she was holding something in her hand, a syringe filled with clear liquid. Mom, what are you doing? What I've been doing for 23 years. Taking care of problems. She descended the stairs slowly, deliberately. You couldn't just let it be, could you? Couldn't just trust that I knew what was best for this family. You're killing him. I'm ending his suffering. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch someone fade away slowly? To see them lose themselves. Piece by piece? Her voice carried the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a slow child. This is mercy, Elena. Kindness. This is murder. This is love. She was at the bottom of the stairs now, the syringe held at her side like a weapon. I loved David enough to free him from his pain. I love your father enough to do the same. And I love you enough to make sure you don't have to live with the burden of knowing. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The video camera wasn't just for documentation, it was for evidence. Mom was creating a record that would show Dad dying peacefully, with his devoted wife by his side, comforting him in his final moments. And I was supposed to be in that video too, the grieving daughter who'd arrived just in time to say goodbye, except I wasn't supposed to survive the experience. The tea, I said suddenly. You were going to put something in the tea. Mom smiled. And it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on another human being. You always were too smart for your own good. Yes, the tea would have been easier. Peaceful. But this works too. She took a step toward me, syringe raised, and that's when I heard something that changed everything. Sirens. Still distant, but getting closer. Mom heard them too. Her face went white, then flushed with rage. What did you do? I called the police. When? Before I came inside. I told them if they didn't hear from me within an hour, something was wrong. It was a lie, but a convincing one. I had called Detective Chen from the church parking lot, but I hadn't set up any kind of check-in system. The sirens might not even be coming here, but Mom didn't know that. She lunged toward me with the syringe, but I was already moving, grabbing the first thing I could reach from Dad's workbench, a hammer, and swinging it toward her hand. The impact sent the syringe flying across the basement, shattering against the concrete wall. Elena, you don't understand what you're doing. Mom's voice had become a desperate snarl. This was supposed to be peaceful. Beautiful. Now you've ruined everything. The sirens were getting louder, and now I could see flashing lights through the basement window. Real sirens. Real police. Detective Chen had taken my call more seriously than I'd realized. Mom looked around the basement frantically, her eyes landing on the bottles of poison arranged on the workbench. For a moment, I thought she might try to force the contents down Dad's throat, to finish what she'd started before the police could stop her. Instead, she reached for the video camera. If I can't have my ending, she said, rewinding the footage with shaking hands, then no one gets to see the truth. But as she fumbled with the camera's controls, I saw something she'd missed in her panic. A small red light in the corner of the basement, partially hidden behind a stack of paint cans. Another camera. One that had been recording everything, including her confession to murdering David and attempting to murder Dad. Someone else had been watching. Someone else had been documenting. And unlike Mom's carefully staged videos, this footage would show the truth. The police flooded through our front door like a SWAT team responding to a hostage situation, which, I realized, was exactly what this had been. Detective Chen led the charge down to the basement, her weapon drawn, taking in the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many domestic crime scenes. But even she seemed stunned by what she found. Dad was rushed to Millbrook General in an ambulance, barely conscious but alive. Mom was handcuffed and read her rights while crime scene technicians began photographing and cataloging what Detective Chen would later describe as the most sophisticated home poisoning laboratory she'd encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. But it was the hidden camera that everyone wanted to understand. Elena, did you install this surveillance equipment? Detective Chen asked as she carefully removed the small device from behind the paint cans. I've never seen it before in my life. The camera was professional grade, not something you'd buy at an electronics store. It had been hardwired into the house's electrical system, suggesting it had been there for months, possibly years. More importantly, it had a wireless transmitter that had been broadcasting everything to an external receiver. Someone's been watching your family for a very long time, Detective Chen said grimly. The question is who? That question was answered 3 hours later when a man I'd never seen before walked into the Millbrook police station carrying a duffel bag and a laptop computer. He was tall, thin, probably in his early 60s, with graying hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time indoors. When he spoke to the desk sergeant, his voice was soft, hesitant, like someone who wasn't accustomed to talking to strangers. My name is Michael Crawford, he said. I believe you have my recordings. Detective Chen and I were called to the interview room where Michael sat with his laptop open, scrolling through what appeared to be thousands of video files organized by date and time. Mr. Crawford, can you explain your relationship to this case? Detective Chen asked. David Crawford was my younger brother. The words hit me like a physical blow. David, Mom's first husband, the man she'd murdered 28 years ago. This was his brother, and judging by the expression on his face, he'd known exactly what Mom had done. I installed the first camera 6 months after David died, Michael continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. Victoria moved too quickly into her new relationship with Thomas. The timing felt wrong, suspicious. But I had no proof, just the intuition of someone who'd watched his brother die under mysterious circumstances. He clicked on a video file dated 3 years earlier. The screen showed our kitchen, the same angle I'd seen thousands of times growing up, but now I was watching it with the knowledge that someone had been secretly documenting our family's most private moments. At first, I was just looking for evidence of insurance fraud or something financially motivated. David had a substantial life insurance policy, and Victoria inherited everything. But what I found was much worse. The video showed Mom preparing Dad's morning coffee with the same methodical precision I'd noticed, but now the camera angle revealed what I'd never been able to see. She was adding something to the cup from a small vial hidden in her bathrobe pocket. I have recordings going back 3 years, Michael said, opening file after file. Hundreds of hours of footage showing Victoria systematically poisoning Thomas. Adding substances to his food, his drinks, his medications. I documented everything. Why didn't you go to the police? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Because I tried that with David's death. I went to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department with my suspicions, told them I thought Victoria had killed my brother. They investigated for about a week, concluded that David died of natural causes related to his heart condition, and basically told me I was a grieving brother looking for someone to blame. Michael's expression was bitter, exhausted. So when I saw her moving on to another victim, I decided to build an airtight case before involving law enforcement again. I needed evidence that was so overwhelming, so undeniable, that no one could dismiss it as the paranoid theories of a grieving relative. Detective Chen was studying the laptop screen with fascination and horror. "Mr. Crawford, this footage is incredibly detailed. You have angles of the kitchen, the bedroom, the basement. How many cameras did you install?" 14. "It took me 2 years to get them all in place. I had to wait for opportunities when the house was empty, learn their routines, figure out how to access the electrical system without detection." He pulled up a schematic on his laptop showing the camera placements throughout the house. "I've been watching Victoria Ashworth commit slow-motion murder for 3 years, documenting every dose, every symptom, every lie she told to medical professionals." "Why didn't you warn us?" I asked, struggling to understand how someone could watch my family suffer for years without intervening. "Why didn't you try to save my father sooner?" Michael's face crumpled with what looked like years of accumulated guilt. "Because I needed her to complete the pattern. I needed proof that this wasn't an isolated incident, that she was a serial killer, not just someone who'd made a terrible mistake once. If I'd intervened too early, she might have stopped, waited, tried again later with better precautions." He opened another file, this one showing Mom in the basement just hours earlier, setting up the 4 equipment and positioning the camera for what she'd planned to be Dad's final scene. "But when I saw her moving Thomas to the basement, when I realized she was accelerating toward murder, I couldn't wait any longer. I called the police anonymously and told them to check on the welfare of the residents at 247 Maple Ridge Road." That explained the sirens that had saved my life. Not my fictional phone call to Detective Chen, but Michael Crawford's desperate decision to finally intervene after 3 years of silent surveillance. "I have recordings of Victoria practicing her grief," Michael continued, clicking on a file. "That showed Mom alone in the kitchen, apparently rehearsing what looked like emotional breakdowns. I have footage of her researching poison symptoms online, ordering substances from overseas suppliers, testing different combinations on laboratory mice she kept in the garage." "She had mice?" "A dozen of them. She'd been perfecting her methods on animals before administering anything to Thomas. Very scientific, very careful. She documented everything in the same notebook you found, Elena, but she also kept digital records." Michael pulled up spreadsheets that looked like something from a pharmaceutical trial, dosage charts, symptom tracking, efficacy ratings. Mom had been approaching murder with the methodical precision of a research scientist. "The most damning evidence is from last week," Michael said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "After Thomas's collapse on Christmas morning, Victoria called someone. A man. They discussed accelerating the timeline because Elena was becoming suspicious. He played an audio recording that made my blood run cold. Mom's voice, calm and businesslike, discussing Dad's murder like she was planning a dinner party. The daughter is going to be a problem. She's asking too many questions, and she has some kind of background in financial investigation. We need to move to the final phase before she figures out what's happening." A man's voice responded, equally calm. "How do you want to handle her?" "Same as the others. Make it look like she arrived just in time to witness Thomas's final moments, then succumbed to grief and stress. Heart attack, stroke, something natural. And then? Then I'm free to start over somewhere else." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, detailing a plan that would have ended with both Dad and me dead, and Mom collecting life insurance payouts before relocating to another state to find her next victim. "Who is the man on the recording?" Detective Chen asked. "Dr. Marcus Henley." The name hit like a physical blow. Dr. Henley, our family physician for 20 years. The man who'd been treating Dad's mysterious symptoms, the man who'd been reassuring us that his condition was being managed appropriately. "Dr. Henley has been Victoria's accomplice from the beginning," Michael explained. "He helped her kill David by providing false medical documentation. He's been doing the same thing with Thomas, running tests that he knew would come back normal, prescribing treatments that wouldn't interfere with Victoria's poisoning, creating a medical paper trail that would support the narrative of natural death." Detective Chen was already on her radio, calling for Dr. Henley's immediate arrest. But Michael wasn't finished. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said, pulling up a final video file. "Victoria and Dr. Henley aren't just business partners. They're married." The screen showed footage from what appeared to be a private ceremony, Mom in a white dress, Dr. Henley in a suit, exchanging vows in what looked like his medical office. The timestamp showed it had taken place 18 months ago. "She's been married to her accomplice while slowly killing Thomas," Michael said. "This entire scheme has been about clearing the way for her to start a new life with Henley, funded by life insurance money from her victims." I sat in that interview room, watching 3 years of secretly recorded evidence of my mother's calculated evil, and finally understood the scope of what had been happening under my nose. This wasn't just poisoning, it was a sophisticated criminal enterprise run by two people who'd turned murder into a profitable business model, and if Michael Crawford hadn't spent 3 years of his life seeking justice for his dead brother, Mom would have gotten away with it again. The next 72 hours passed like a fever dream of hospital corridors, police interviews, and media attention I never could have imagined. Dad was in the ICU at Denver General, where a team of toxicologists worked around the clock to identify and neutralize the cocktail of poisons Mom had been administering. Dr. Sarah Patel, the lead toxicologist, told me it was the most complex poisoning case she'd seen in her career. Your father has been exposed to at least 6 different heavy metals and pharmaceutical compounds over an extended period, she explained during one of my endless vigils at his bedside. The fact that he's alive is miraculous. Most people wouldn't have survived the first 6 months of this level of systematic poisoning. But Dad was stronger than anyone had given him credit for. By day 3, his color had improved dramatically. The tremors in his hands were subsiding, and for the first time in months, his eyes were clear and focused when he looked at me. Elena, he said on Thursday morning, his voice still weak but unmistakably his own. I feel like I've been asleep for years and I'm just now waking up. How much do you remember, Dad? Pieces. Like fragments of a nightmare I couldn't quite shake. He struggled to sit up straighter in his hospital bed. I remember feeling confused all the time, like my thoughts were wrapped in cotton. I remember your mother being so helpful, so concerned, but something about it felt. He paused, searching for words. Wrong. Like she was performing instead of living. The doctors said it would take months, possibly years, for Dad to fully recover from the neurological damage, but every day brought visible improvements. More importantly, every day brought back pieces of the Thomas Ashworth I'd grown up with, his sense of humor, his curiosity about the world, his natural warmth that had been buried under months of pharmaceutical confusion. Meanwhile, the legal machinery was moving with unprecedented speed. Dr. Henley had been arrested at his medical practice while attempting to shred patient files. When police searched his office, they found a storage room filled with documentation going back 15 years, records of other patients who died under suspicious circumstances while under his care, insurance claims that had been filed shortly after unexplained deaths, and correspondence with Mom detailing their methods and profits. We're looking at potentially dozens of victims, Detective Chen told me during one of our daily briefings. Your mother and Dr. Henley appear to have been running this operation across 3 different states. They would target recently married men with substantial life insurance policies, develop relationships with them or their spouses, then either directly poison them or convince the spouses to participate in gradual murder schemes. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. They developed a network of corrupt pharmacy suppliers, forged medical credentials to access restricted substances, and created elaborate cover stories that had fooled law enforcement and medical professionals for over a decade. Mom wasn't just a serial killer, she was the ringleader of a criminal enterprise that had turned murder into a profitable business, but understanding the scope of their crimes didn't make facing the media circus any easier. By Friday, our story had gone national. Camera crews lined Maple Ridge Road, reporters knocked on neighbors' doors, and my phone rang constantly with interview requests from true crime podcasters and documentary filmmakers. I refused them all. This wasn't entertainment, this was my family's trauma, and I wasn't going to let it be turned into content for people's morbid curiosity. However, there was one interview I did agree to, a local news station that wanted to focus on recognizing the signs of elder abuse and medical manipulation. If sharing our story could help even one person identify similar situations, it felt like an obligation rather than an exploitation. The most important thing people need to understand, I told reporter Jessica Martinez, is that predators like my mother don't look like monsters. They look like devoted caregivers. They appear to be doing everything right, managing medications, coordinating medical care, advocating for their victims. The abuse is hidden inside what looks like love. That interview aired on a Tuesday evening, and by Wednesday morning, my phone was ringing with calls from people who recognized similar patterns in their own families. Adult children worried about their parents' rapid health declines. Suspicious relatives who'd noticed controlling behavior from caregivers. Medical professionals who'd had nagging doubts about certain patient cases but hadn't known how to voice their concerns. I found myself becoming an accidental advocate, spending hours on the phone with people who needed someone to believe their suspicions, someone to validate their concerns about loved ones who were deteriorating under the care of people who should have been protecting them. Detective Chen connected me with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's Elder Abuse Task Force, and within 2 weeks, I was working part-time as a consultant, helping investigators recognize the financial and behavioral patterns that indicated systematic abuse. My background in forensic accounting turned out to be perfectly suited for tracking the paper trails that predators like Mom and Dr. Henley left behind. You have a gift for seeing connections that other people miss, Task Force Director Maria Santos told me after I'd helped identify 3 additional cases linked to Mom's network. More importantly, you understand the emotional manipulation tactics because you've lived through them. That perspective is invaluable. The work was painful but purposeful. Every case we solved, every predator we exposed, felt like a victory. Not just for the victims but for Dad, for David Crawford, for all the people who'd been silenced by caregivers who'd turned love into a weapon, but the most meaningful transformation wasn't professional, it was personal. For the first time in my adult life, I was building a relationship with my father based on truth instead of the carefully constructed lies Mom had woven around our family. Dad moved into a rehabilitation facility in Denver, close enough that I could visit daily but far enough from Millbrook that he didn't have to face the constant reminders of what had been done to him. We spent hours talking about everything Mom had hidden from both of us, his memories of David Crawford, whom he genuinely liked and considered a friend, his early suspicions about Dr. Henley's treatment recommendations, his growing awareness that something was wrong with his mind but his inability to trust his own perceptions. I kept thinking I was losing my mind, he told me one afternoon as we sat in the facility's garden, watching mountains he'd been too sick to appreciate for months. But the worst part wasn't the confusion, it was feeling like I couldn't trust my own daughter. Victoria would tell me things you'd said or done, conversations we'd supposedly had, and I couldn't remember any of it. She convinced me that you thought I was becoming a burden. Dad, I never said anything like that. I was worried about you, but I never thought you were a burden. I know that now. But at the time, I believed her completely. She had this way of making her version of reality feel more real than my own memories. That was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Mom's abuse. She hadn't just poisoned Dad's body, she'd poisoned his relationships, his self-trust, his connection to the people who loved him. Rebuilding those bonds required patience and forgiveness, not just from me but from Dad toward himself for believing her lies. By the end of January, Dad was strong enough to attend the preliminary hearings for Mom and Dr. Henley's cases. He insisted on being there, despite his lawyer's concerns about the emotional toll. I need to see her face when the truth comes out, he said. I need to look her in the eye and know that I survived what she tried to do to me. The courtroom was packed with victims' family members, investigators, and media representatives. Mom sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair no longer perfect, her makeup replaced by the pale exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. When the prosecutor read the charges, first-degree murder, attempted murder, conspiracy, insurance fraud, elder abuse, practicing medicine without a license, Mom's expression never changed. She stared straight ahead with the blank effect of someone who'd shut down emotionally rather than face the magnitude of her crimes. But when the prosecutor played excerpts from Michael Crawford's surveillance footage, when the courtroom saw her methodically adding poison to Dad's coffee, when they heard her voice planning my murder with casual indifference, something shifted in her posture. For just a moment, she looked in our direction. Dad met her gaze steadily, and I saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes, not anger, not hatred, but complete absence of fear. For the first time in years, Thomas Ashworth was looking at Victoria without wondering if he could trust his own perceptions, without second-guessing his instincts, without the fog of confusion she'd deliberately created. She looked away first. After the hearing, as we walked out of the courthouse past the cluster of reporters and camera crews, Dad stopped on the steps and turned to face the crowd. I want to say something, he announced, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. My wife tried to kill me slowly, over years, while pretending to love me. She almost succeeded. But I'm still here, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left helping other people recognize the signs we missed. If our story helps save even one person from what I went through, then everything we've suffered will have meaning. That night, as I helped Dad settle into his room at the rehabilitation facility, he looked more like himself than he had in years. The Thomas Ashworth who'd raised me, who'd taught me to change tires and balance checkbooks and stand up for what was right, was finally coming back. Elena, he said as I was getting ready to leave, I need you to know something. Even when I was at my sickest, even when I couldn't think clearly, I never stopped loving you. Victoria tried to poison that too, but some things are stronger than her lies. Standing in that doorway, looking at my father who'd survived systematic murder and was choosing to use his experience to help others, I realized that Mom had failed in the most fundamental way possible. She'd tried to destroy our family, but instead, she'd made us stronger than we'd ever been before. The call came on a rainy Thursday morning in March, 3 months after Mom's arrest. I was at my desk in the CBI Elder Abuse Task Force office. reviewing financial records for a case in Colorado Springs, when Detective Chen's name appeared on my phone screen. Elena, Victoria wants to see you. I'd been dreading this moment since the day she was arrested. Mom had been held without bail at the Jefferson County Detention Center, and according to her public defender, she'd refused all visits from family members and had barely spoken to anyone except her lawyer. But apparently something had changed. What does she want? She says she has information about other cases, other victims. But she'll only talk to you. I don't want to see her. I understand. But Elena, if she has information that could help us identify more victims, could help us find more families like yours. Detective Chen's voice was gentle but persistent. You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. I talked it over with Dad that evening during our daily dinner at the rehabilitation facility. He was doing remarkably well, his physical therapy was ahead of schedule, his cognitive function was nearly back to normal, and he'd started teaching woodworking classes to other residents. But I could see the shadow that crossed his face when I mentioned Mom's request. Do you think she really has information about other victims? He asked. I think she has information about something. Whether it's other victims or just another manipulation, I don't know. Dad was quiet for a long moment, absently turning his wedding ring, the ring he'd finally taken off the week before. Elena, I've been thinking about this a lot. About forgiveness, about closure, about what it means to move forward. You don't have to forgive her, Dad. I know that. But I also know that she still has power over both of us as long as we're afraid of her, as long as we're avoiding the truth about what she did and why she did it. He looked at me with eyes that were clearer and more determined than they'd been in years. I think you should go see her. Not for her sake, but for ours. Will you come with me? If you want me to. 2 days later, Dad and I sat in the visitors' room at Jefferson County Detention Center, waiting for the guards to bring Mom in. The room was sterile and depressing, gray walls, fluorescent lighting, plastic chairs bolted to the floor. Everything was designed to be functional rather than comfortable, which seemed appropriate for the conversation we were about to have. When the door opened and Mom walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, I was shocked by how much she'd changed. She'd always been meticulous about her appearance, but the woman who sat down across from us looked older, thinner, almost frail. Her hair was gray at the roots, her skin pale from months without sunlight, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup could never have hidden, but when she looked at us, her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. Even stripped of her freedom and her facade, Victoria Ashworth was still assessing angles, still looking for leverage. Hello, Thomas. Elena. Her voice was surprisingly steady, almost conversational, as if we were meeting for coffee instead of confronting a would-be murderer. Thank you for coming. Detective Chen said you have information about other victims, I said without preamble. Let's hear it. Mom smiled, and the expression was so familiar, so reminiscent of 1,000 family dinners and birthday celebrations, that it made my stomach clench. Always direct. You get that from your father. Stop. Dad's voice was firm, authoritative in a way I hadn't heard since before his poisoning began. You don't get to make small talk with us. You don't get to pretend this is a normal family conversation. Say what you came here to say. Something shifted in Mom's expression, surprise, maybe, at hearing Dad speak with such clarity and strength. For a moment, I saw a flicker of what might have been genuine emotion cross her face before the mask slipped back into place. There are 17 families, she said quietly. 17 men who died while under Marcus's medical care and my supervision. The records are hidden in a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Denver. Box number 847. The key is taped under the drawer of my jewelry box at home. 17. The number hit me like a physical blow. 17 families who'd watched their loved ones decline and die, never knowing they were witnessing murder. 17 funerals where Mom and Dr. Henley had probably offered comfort and condolences to the grieving widows they'd helped create. Why? Are you telling us this now? I asked. Because Marcus is trying to blame everything on me. He's telling prosecutors that I manipulated him, that he was an unwilling participant who got in too deep to back out. Mom's laugh was bitter, hollow. 20 years of partnership, and he's throwing me under the bus to save himself. So this is revenge? This is truth. For the first time since sitting down, Mom looked directly at Dad. Thomas, I need you to understand something. What I did to you, what I did to David, what we did to all those men, it wasn't personal. It was never about hatred or cruelty. Then what was it about? Dad's voice was deadly quiet. Survival. Mom leaned forward, her handcuffs clinking against the metal table. Do you have any idea what it's like to be completely powerless? To watch your life slip away because you married the wrong person, made the wrong choices, trusted the wrong people. Are you talking about David? I'm talking about my first marriage. Before David. Before any of you. Mom's voice dropped to a whisper, and for the first time, I heard something that sounded like genuine pain underneath her words. I was 19 when I married Robert Kelman. Sweet, charming Robert, who turned into a monster the moment we said I do. She told us about 5 years of abuse, physical, emotional, financial, that had left her trapped in a marriage to a man who controlled every aspect of her life. When she finally found the courage to leave, Robert had threatened to kill her if she ever tried to divorce him. I was working as a nurse's aide at the time. I had access to medications, and I knew what different drugs could do to the human body. So I started slipping things into Robert's food, just small amounts at first, enough to make him sick but not enough to kill him. I told myself I was just buying time, making him weak enough that he couldn't hurt me anymore. But he died, Dad said. He died. And for the first time in 5 years, I could breathe. Mom's eyes were distant now, lost in memories that were decades old. I inherited his life insurance money, his house, his car. Suddenly I had options, freedom, the ability to choose my own life. But more than that, I had power. So you decided to use that power to kill more people? I decided to use that power to take care of myself. David was supposed to be different. I actually loved him, or thought I did. But then he got sick, really sick, and I realized I was going to end up as a caregiver again, trapped in another situation where someone else's needs controlled my entire life. Mom's confession was delivered with the flat effect of someone recounting a grocery list rather than multiple murders. She described her marriage to David as a business transaction that had outlived its usefulness, his murder as a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. And Dad? I asked. What was your excuse for trying to kill him? Thomas was supposed to be my retirement plan. A stable, healthy man with good insurance and a nice house. But then he started talking about wanting to travel when he turned 60, wanting to sell the house and buy an RV, wanting to see the world. She looked at Dad with something that might have been regret. You were going to disrupt everything I'd worked for. I needed you stable, manageable, dependent on me for care. So you made me sick. I made you need me. There's a difference. Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. No, Victoria. There's no difference. You poisoned me because my dreams for our future didn't match your plans for controlling me. You turned me into a victim because you couldn't stand the thought of being an equal partner in a marriage. Mom's facade finally cracked. For just a moment, I saw raw fury in her eyes, the same expression she'd worn in the basement when she tried to inject me with poison. Equal partner, she spat. You think any of my marriages were partnerships? You think David or Robert or any man I've ever known has treated me as an equal? Men take and take and take until there's nothing left, and then they're surprised when women like me figure out how to take something back. So this was feminism? I asked, incredulous. Murder as empowerment? This was survival in a world that gives women very few options for real power. Mom's voice had gone cold again, all emotion carefully controlled. I found a way to be financially independent, to never have to depend on anyone else for my security. If that required removing obstacles, so be it. The guards were signaling that our time was almost up. Mom had given us the information about the safety deposit box, provided details about Dr. Henley's role in the conspiracy, and revealed the location of evidence that would help prosecutors build cases for 17 additional murders. But she'd also given us something else, insight into the twisted logic that had allowed her to justify decades of murder. As she stood to leave, Mom looked at Dad one last time. For what it's worth, Thomas, you were the best of them. If you'd been willing to live the life I wanted instead of the life you dreamed of, I might have let you live. If I'd been willing to let you control me completely, you mean? Same thing. After she was gone, Dad and I sat in the visitor's room for several minutes, neither of us speaking. Finally, he reached across the table and took my hand. I need you to know something, Elena. What she just told us, that's not an explanation, it's an excuse. There are millions of women who've survived abuse, who've been powerless and trapped and hurt, and they don't become serial killers. Victoria chose to become a predator because it was easier than becoming a survivor. Do you think she was telling the truth about being abused by her first husband? Probably. But that doesn't excuse what she did to David, or to me, or to those 17 other men. Dad's voice was steady, certain. Pain doesn't justify causing more pain. Victimization doesn't justify becoming a victimizer. As we walked out of the detention center and into the spring sunshine, I realized that this confrontation hadn't given me the closure I'd hoped for. Instead, it had given me something more valuable, absolute certainty that the woman who'd raised me was fundamentally different from the people I chose to surround myself with. Victoria Ashworth's version of strength was built on control and cruelty. Real strength, The kind Dad was showing, the kind I was learning, was built on truth and the courage to face it. 1 year later, I stood at the podium of the National Conference on Elder Abuse Prevention, looking out at an audience of 500 social workers, law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and family advocates. Dad sat in the front row, healthy and strong, wearing the wooden pin he'd carved himself, a small eagle with its wings spread wide, symbolizing freedom from captivity. When I discovered my mother was poisoning my father, I thought I was dealing with a family crisis. What I actually uncovered was a criminal enterprise that had been operating for over 20 years, claiming at least 19 lives across 4 states, and generating nearly $2 million in fraudulent insurance claims. The final numbers had been staggering. The evidence from Mom's safety deposit box led to the identification of 17 additional victims, just as she'd promised. But the investigation had revealed an even larger network, other medical professionals, pharmacies, and even funeral homes that had been part of the conspiracy. Dr. Henley's cooperation with prosecutors, motivated by his desperate attempt to avoid the death penalty, had exposed a systematic operation that spanned decades. Mom had been sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Dr. Henley received consecutive life sentences for his role in 19 murders. 3 other conspirators, a pharmacy technician, a medical records clerk, and a funeral director, were serving sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. But today I don't want to talk about the criminals, I continued, scanning the faces in the audience. I want to talk about the survivors, the families who've rebuilt their lives after discovering unthinkable betrayals, and the professionals who've learned to recognize patterns that hide in plain sight. The Elder Abuse Task Force had grown into a national model, with training programs now operating in 12 states. My role had evolved from part-time consultant to director of financial crimes investigation, leading a team of forensic accountants, social workers, and law enforcement officers who specialized in uncovering hidden abuse. The most important lesson we've learned is that sophisticated abuse doesn't look like violence. It looks like care. It looks like devotion. It looks like love. I clicked to the next slide in my presentation, showing a photo of Mom helping Dad with his morning coffee, one of Michael Crawford's surveillance images that had become evidence in her trial. The people who are best at hiding abuse are often the ones who appear most dedicated to their victims' well-being. After my presentation, I was approached by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a geriatrician from Seattle whose own father had died under circumstances remarkably similar to what Dad had experienced. My father was being cared for by his second wife when he started showing signs of cognitive decline, she explained. She was so attentive, so organized with his medications, so knowledgeable about his condition. Even as a doctor, I never suspected that she might be causing his symptoms rather than managing them. What made you finally realize something was wrong? She tried to get him to update his will to leave everything to her instead of his children. When we questioned it, she became defensive, started isolating him from family visits. By the time we involved Adult Protective Services, he was too sick to communicate clearly. He died 2 weeks later. Dr. Walsh's story was heartbreakingly familiar. In the past year, our task force had investigated 47 similar cases. Not all of them involved murder, some were just financial exploitation or medical abuse designed to increase dependency rather than cause death. But all of them followed patterns that trained eyes could learn to recognize. Dr. Walsh, I want you to meet someone, I said, gesturing for Dad to join us. Dad had become an unofficial spokesperson for elder abuse awareness, sharing his story at medical conferences and community education events. But more than that, he'd become living proof that recovery was possible, that victims could reclaim their lives and their identities even after years of systematic abuse. The most important thing I want people to understand, Dad told Dr. Walsh, is that being a victim doesn't define you forever. Victoria tried to convince me that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't trust my own perceptions, that I was becoming a burden to my family. Even after we discovered the truth, I struggled with believing that I could be whole again. What changed? That for you? Choosing to help other people. Finding purpose in preventing what happened to me from happening to someone else. Dad's smile was genuine, peaceful in a way I hadn't seen since I was a child. Victoria took 3 years of my life, but she didn't get to take the rest of it. That evening, Dad and I had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Denver skyline, a tradition we'd established to mark the anniversary of Mom's arrest. He'd moved into a senior living community 6 months earlier, not because he needed care, but because he enjoyed the social atmosphere and the woodworking shop they'd built for residents' use. Elena, I need to tell you something, he said as we waited for our dessert to arrive. I've been seeing someone. I nearly choked on my wine. What? Her name is Margaret. She's a retired librarian, lost her husband to cancer 5 years ago. We met in the woodworking shop. She was trying to build bookshelves for her apartment. Dad's cheeks were slightly pink, and he looked like a teenager admitting to his first crush. I know it might seem too soon, or inappropriate given everything that happened with your mother. Dad, it's been over a year since Mom was arrested, and your marriage to her was over long before that. You have every right to find happiness with someone who treats you well. Margaret knows everything about what happened. I told her the whole story because I never want to build a relationship on lies or hidden truths again. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She says she admires how we've turned our trauma into something that helps other people. As I listened to Dad talk about Margaret, how she made him laugh, how they spent hours discussing books and travel plans, how she encouraged his woodworking and never tried to manage or control his choices, I realized that this was what victory looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or courtroom verdicts, but quiet moments of genuine happiness built on foundations of honesty and mutual respect. There's something else, Dad continued. Margaret and I are planning to volunteer together with a program that visits isolated seniors. Too many elderly people are vulnerable to predators because they're lonely, because they don't have family members checking on them regularly. That's amazing, Dad. I keep thinking about all those families who never found out the truth about their loved ones' deaths. All those people who died thinking they were losing their minds, never knowing they were being murdered. Dad's expression was serious now, determined. If Margaret and I can help even one person avoid that fate, if we can be the eyes and ears that notice when something isn't right, then maybe some good can come from what we went through. Later that night, I sat in my apartment reviewing case files for the next day's investigations. On my desk were photos from the conference, hundreds of professionals who now knew how to recognize the signs we'd missed, who could protect vulnerable people from predators like Mom and Dr. Henley. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Crawford, who'd become an unexpected friend over the past year. He'd used the media attention from our case to establish a foundation focused on training family members to recognize signs of elder abuse. Saw your presentation online. David would be proud of what you and Thomas have built from this tragedy. Thank you for giving his death meaning. I thought about that phrase, giving death meaning, and realized it applied to more than just David. The 19 men Mom and Dr. Henley had murdered, the countless other victims of similar predators, the families who'd suffered through mysterious illnesses and inexplicable losses, their stories now formed the foundation of education programs that were protecting other families, but more than that, Dad and I had discovered something powerful in the aftermath of nearly losing everything. The difference between surviving trauma and transforming it. Mom had tried to turn her early victimization into justification for becoming a predator. We'd chosen to turn our victimization into a mission to protect others. As I prepared for bed, I looked at the photo on my nightstand, Dad and me at last. Month's task force graduation ceremony, surrounded by the first class of investigators we'd trained to recognize financial patterns in elder abuse cases. Both of us were smiling, genuinely happy, completely free from the shadow of fear that had dominated our lives for so many years. Victoria Ashworth had spent decades perfecting the art of destroying lives while maintaining a facade of love and care. She'd turned marriage into a murder weapon and caregiving into a business model. She'd convinced medical professionals, neighbors, and even her own family that her victims' suffering was natural, inevitable, beyond anyone's power to prevent, but in the end, her most fundamental miscalculation was believing that breaking people would keep them broken. Dad's strength had returned along with his health. My purpose had grown from the ashes of betrayal. Together, we'd built something that would outlast her crimes and protect families she would never get the chance to destroy. Sometimes the people who try to silence us most are the ones who fear our voices the loudest. Victoria had spent years trying to convince Dad that he couldn't trust his own mind, trying to convince me that I was imagining problems that didn't exist. She'd used confusion and doubt as weapons, making us question our own perceptions rather than her actions. Now our voices were saving lives, and her silencing had become evidence of her guilt. If you're watching this and something about your family situation doesn't feel right, if someone who claims to love you is making you doubt your own mind, if a caregiver seems more invested in controlling than helping, trust your instincts. Ask questions. Demand answers. Seek help from people who have no investment in maintaining the status quo, because sometimes the person who's supposed to protect you is the one you most need protection from. And sometimes the only way to save someone is to first save yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.